Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're going deep on a guy whose name is synonymous with both big business and big controversy. That's right, we're talking John D. Rockefeller,
The Standard Oil guy.
the one and only.
Yeah.
And get this, we've got a really cool mix of sources to dig into. We've got biographies, we've got historical accounts, and even some of his personal letters.
My personal letters. That's got to get some good insight.
Totally. It's going to help us get a real sense of this complex figure, right? And how he built this massive business empire, how he became, well, John D. Rockefeller.
He's definitely a fascinating and often controversial figure. I mean, you've got this devout Baptist who is also a ruthlessly ambitious capitalist. It's a real head-scratcher sometimes.
It really is. And that's what makes this deep dive so interesting, right?
Yeah.
We're talking about a guy who was operating in the Wild West of post-Civil War America.
Yeah, think about it. Industries were booming, fortunes being made and lost left and right. It was a time ripe for the taking.
And Rockefeller, he's right there in the thick of it.
Mm-hmm.
So the big question for me is, what drove him? What were those personality traits, that helped him navigate this crazy world and build Standard Oil into this, global powerhouse?
That's a great question. And to really understand Rockefeller's drive, I think you have to go back to his roots. His dad, William Avery Rockefeller, who was known as Devil Bill.
Devil Bill, wow.
Yeah, quite a character, but he was this charismatic but kind of shady figure. He did a little bit of everything, peddling, dealing timber, even claimed to be a physician at one point.
The jack of all trades, huh?
Pretty much. And he was obsessed with money, notorious for his shady deals. So young John D., he definitely got a taste of that side of things.
So that's the Devil Bill influence.
Mm-hmm.
But what about his mom? Didn't she have a totally different approach?
Oh, absolutely. His mom, Eliza, was a devout Baptist, the opposite of Devil Bill. And she instilled in him those classic values, thrift, order, hard work.
The bedrock of good business practices.
Exactly. It's almost like, nature versus nurture playing out in real life.
So how did these two contrasting influences shape young John D.?
Well, one key moment is when he's just 16. He gets this bookkeeping job at a produce commission firm, Hewitt and Tuttle. Now, it sounds pretty ordinary.
Right, a basic first job.
Yeah, but it was crucial. This is where he really got a handle on accounting, negotiation, the power of numbers.
Became a numbers guy, huh?
Oh, yeah. He started to see numbers as these, sacred tools for decision-making, for exposing inefficiencies.
I can see that being super valuable later on.
You bet. That meticulousness, that became a hallmark of his business practices. And then, at just 20 years old, he starts his own produce commission firm with this guy, Maurice B. Clark.
Wow, 20 years old. Already an entrepreneur.
But here's the thing, even then, he's got his eyes on something bigger. He's looking at the oil industry.
Oil. It was the new frontier, wasn't it? A bit like the Wild West.
Exactly. Full of risk, full of potential. And it takes a certain type of person to jump into that. Someone with, vision and guts.
And Rockefeller had both, it sounds like.
Oh, he did. And he was smart about it. He gradually shifted his focus, started investing in oil refineries.
That was a brand new industry back then, right? A lot of unknowns.
It was. And this is where another key trait of his comes in his ability to find and work with the best people. He partnered up with this chemist, Samuel Andrews.
Smart move.
Oh, yeah. Andrews had all this expertise in refining technology. It gave Rockefeller a huge edge over the competition.
So we've got the drive, the vision, the discipline, and now he's building this expert team.
Yeah.
Sounds like the recipe for success.
It really is. But we haven't even gotten to Standard Oil yet. That's when things really take off.
Yeah, that's the big one. I'm ready for the Standard Oil story.
Okay, so 1870 rolls around, and Rockefeller officially establishes Standard Oil of Ohio. And he had a mission, a clear goal. He wanted to bring order to the oil industry.
Order. Sounds like things were pretty chaotic back then.
They were. It was a total frenzy. Hundreds of small refineries popping up. Competition was fierce. Prices all over the place.
I bet that drove a guy like Rockefeller crazy. Mr. Order and Efficiency himself.
It probably did. But he saw it as an opportunity, too. An opportunity not just to profit, but to dominate.
And to dominate he did. But that's where some of his more, let's say, questionable tactics come into play.
Right, the robber baron accusations start flying around this time.
Okay, so let's talk about those tactics. This is where things get really interesting.
It's amazing how he used that need for control, right, to build Standard Oil into something, unprecedented. Like, he wasn't content with just playing the game. He wanted to rewrite the rules.
And rewrite them he did. But I gotta say, some of his methods were a little aggressive, shall we say. This is where that whole robber baron thing comes in, right?
This starts to get a bit cutthroat around this time. You look at what happened in Cleveland in 1872. They don't call it the Cleveland Massacre for nothing.
I was just reading about that. In a matter of weeks, he buys out 22 of his 26 competitors. That's wild.
It's almost complete domination. Like, how did he convince all these rivals to just give up?
Yeah, what was the strategy there? Was it just a better offer, or was there something more to it?
Well, Rockefeller, he was a master negotiator, no doubt. But he wasn't afraid to play hardball either. Like, he'd use his connections with the railroads to get cheaper shipping rates for Standard Oil. Big rebates.
Ah, so he's using his size and his influence to kind of squeeze out the competition.
Exactly. He was always thinking a few steps ahead, like a chess master, planning his next move. And there was this cartel, the South Improvement Company, really powerful.
I read about them. Pretty shady bunch.
Yeah. And Rockefeller, he was a key player in that. He'd use the threat of this cartel, to pressure rivals into selling. It was like, join me or get crushed.
A pretty effective strategy, I guess.
Hmm.
So it was business smarts, yeah, but also strategic alliances and, let's be honest, a bit of intimidation.
It was, but it worked. He took control of Cleveland, and from there, Standard Oil just exploded across the country.
And it wasn't just about acquiring companies. It was about owning every part of the process, wasn't it?
Right. Drilling, refining, transporting, even retail. He called it vertical integration, and it was revolutionary back then.
Vertical integration. So basically, he wanted to control it all, from the ground to the gas pump.
Pretty much. And it all came back to his obsession with efficiency. Any waste, any inefficiency, it drove him crazy.
He was famous for sweating the small stuff, right? Like, I read somewhere that he obsessed over how many drops of solder were used to seal oil cans.
Oh, yeah. That was Rockefeller. Always looking for ways to cut costs, optimize every little detail. And that's why Standard Oil could sell oil so cheaply. They were just that much better at it.
It's hard to argue with the results, even if some of his tactics were questionable. The guy was a business genius.
He was. But all that expansion, those tactics, it started to attract attention. People started to get worried about Standard Oil, calling it a monopoly.
The backlash begins. This is where he really starts to get that robber baron label, right?
Yep. Journalists like Henry Demarest Lloyd and Ida Tarbell, they start exposing his methods, really stirring up public anger, saying he was stifling competition, manipulating the market, holding too much power.
It must have been tough being in the spotlight like that. How did he handle it? Did he ever try to defend himself?
Rockefeller, he mostly kept quiet. He believed that he was doing the right thing, bringing order to a chaotic industry. He saw himself as the problem solver, not the villain.
I wonder if that silence, that kind of aloofness, made the public even more suspicious of him.
It probably didn't help. It made him seem, well, maybe a little arrogant, like he was above it all, and he kept finding ways to consolidate his power even more. Like in 1882, Standard Oil forms this thing called a trust.
A trust, what is that exactly?
So imagine a way to create like this mega corporation, even when states had laws against monopolies. The trust, it allowed him to control all these different companies without technically owning them.
That's sneaky.
Oh, yeah. And it sparked outrage, lawsuits, the whole 9 yards. But Rockefeller, he was always one step ahead. Like when the Ohio Supreme Court rules against the trust in 1892, forces it to dissolve.
I remember reading about that. It was a big deal.
Huge. But what does Rockefeller do? He just reorganizes the company under New Jersey law.
Of course he did.
Always finding a loophole. But that cat and mouse game with the government, it couldn't last forever.
So what finally brought him down?
The big one was in 1911. The U.S. Supreme Court, they rule that Standard Oil violated the Sherman Antitrust Act. They order it to be broken up, split into 34 separate companies.
Wow. The breakup of Standard Oil, that's like a landmark moment in American history, right? It really showed that even the biggest companies weren't above the law. But how did Rockefeller take it? Was he crushed?
It's funny because, well, the breakup actually ended up making him even richer.
Wait, what? How does that even work?
So the combined value of all those smaller companies, it ended up being greater than the original Standard Oil. And Rockefeller, he still owned a huge chunk of the shares.
So he loses his company but comes out on top. Talk about irony.
He always had a way of landing on his feet, It wasn't just luck. It was his personality, his ability to adapt. Like I said, always playing the long game.
Always thinking ahead. But by this point, he's starting to shift his focus anyway, right? Moving away from oil and into something new. Philanthropy.
You got it. Early 1900s, he's starting to have some health issues, and maybe he's also looking to, polish his image a bit after all those robber baron years.
So oil baron to philanthropist. quite the change. But was it genuine, or was it all just a PR move? That's the big question.
That's what we're going to figure out. Let's dive into his philanthropic work and see if we can find some answers.
So Rockefeller's turning his attention to philanthropy. But is it really a change of heart, or just a clever PR move?
It's hard to say for sure, but one thing's for sure. He approached philanthropy just like he approached business, with strategy, careful planning, that same drive for efficiency.
He wasn't just writing checks then. He was investing strategically, trying to make the biggest impact, huh?
Yeah, think about it. He's got all this wealth, and he wants to use it to, well, make a difference.
So what were some of his big projects? What did he focus on?
One of the significant was the University of Chicago, founded in 1890. He basically envisioned it as this like world-class research institution.
The University of Chicago. That's huge.
Yeah.
So it wasn't just about money for him. It was about knowledge, education, making a real contribution.
Exactly. He poured millions into building up the faculty, the facilities, and it paid off. It quickly became one of the top universities in the country.
Okay, so maybe there's more to him than just the ruthless businessman.
Mm-hmm.
But still, it's kind of hard to square that image with, the guy who built Standard Oil.
It is a bit of a contradiction, isn't it? But it's also what makes him so interesting. And the University of Chicago wasn't the only thing. He also created the General Education Board in 1902.
What was that all about?
It was focused on improving education across the U.S., but especially in the South. They were really behind in terms of access to quality education back then.
Right. He saw education as, like, the key to progress, huh?
Makes it so. It was about lifting people up, giving them opportunities.
Makes sense. So education was one big focus. What else?
Well, he was also really big on medical research. He founded the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research. It's Rockefeller University today.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of it.
And that led to some major breakthroughs in public health. Like they developed a serum for meningitis, a vaccine for yellow fever. They saved countless lives.
Man, it's crazy. On one hand, you got the guy who built this massive monopoly, but on the other, he's funding research that's helping people all over the world.
Yeah. It's complicated. He was definitely a man of contradictions. But that's what makes his story so fascinating, right?
It is. It makes you think about, human nature, good and bad.
Mm-hmm.
Like, is anyone all good or all bad?
Right. John D. Rockefeller, he was both a product of his time and a guy who, well, he shaped that time too.
He definitely left his mark. There's no question about that.
Thinking about his whole life, I think one of the key takeaways is, his self-belief. He was unwavering. Like, whether he was building Standard Oil or funding a university, he went after it with everything he had.
Yeah. He wasn't afraid to think big.
Yeah.
And he knew how to plan, how to strategize.
And he knew how to delegate, build a good team, find people who shared his vision.
And that discipline, that work ethic, I mean, he was legendary for that. Always focused on efficiency, on doing things the right way.
That's for sure. So, what's the big takeaway here? What do we want our listener to remember about John D. Rockefeller?
It's a good question.
I think it's this. His story shows us that success, any kind of success, it takes vision, strategy, discipline, and you got to be able to adapt. The world's always changing. And yeah, his methods weren't always, ethical, but you can't deny the impact he had on industry, on society. He changed America.
That's a great point, and a great way to wrap things up. We've covered a lot of ground today. John D. Rockefeller, the oil empire, the philanthropy, the controversy. He was a complicated guy, but there's no doubt he left his mark on history. He makes you think, Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. Until next time.